Today I'm going to show you how to make a fancy edge for your Quilt As You Go quilts. I hope you enjoy this video. Welcome back to the Pattern Poole studio. It's a beautiful, rainy, stormy day here near Sydney, Australia, and it's the perfect day for sewing. So to demonstrate today's lesson, I'm going to put a fancy edge on my scrappy quilt that I joined together last week using my Quilt As You Go easy cover strip method. And if you missed that, you can check it out in the card above. So let's get started. So why a fancy edge? Well, fancy edges, it's a great way to elevate the design with a beautiful, unique finish, and they're really easy to do and they just look really pretty. What can I say? So here's a quilt here. I've actually done a curve with a point. On this one here, just pretty simple scallops. More scallops on this one here. And on this one here, I have done a pointy edge, and I call this one a pointy edge because it just looks like, no I don't, I call it a picket edge because it looks like the top of a picket fence. Now I have already done a video showing how to do the scallop edge on this quilt here, so you can go back and check that one out. But today's video is all about making this pointy edge, but I'm going to give you lots of tips and tricks and advice along the way, just in case you want to make your own kind of shaped scallop edge. So if you like any of these quilts, most of them are available as PDF downloads on our website. Okay, so before we make our template and before we work out how much fabric we're going to need, first of all I'm going to measure my quilt. So I've drawn up a diagram of my quilt. My quilt is made up of blocks. I have 6 blocks across, 6 blocks down, and they all finish at approximately 9 inches square. So I'm going to measure my quilt. I'm going to measure my quilt in 3 places going acrossways. So top, bottom, and through the center, and then I'm going to turn it and do the same thing. And then I'm going to write my measurements next to my diagram. First of all, I'm going to measure across the top edge of my quilt. Don't measure right on the edge because your quilt could be a little bit wavy, so it could be a little bit bigger around the outer edges. So I like to measure about 4 inches away from the edge. Okay, so I've measured up my quilt and now I'm going to show you how I work out how much fabric we need. So my fancy edges always start with 4-inch strips. So fancy edge equals 4-inch strips. And I'm going to work this out on regular fabric width. So regular fabric is about 42 to 44 inches and I like to work on 40 inches. So fabric width, 40 inches. Okay, so now with my measurements here, you can see I have 54 3/8 going across this edge here, whereas down here I have 54 1/4. So this is a square quilt, and I'm just going to go with the smaller measurement because I can easily ease in that extra 1/8 of an inch there. So if you have a quilt that's rectangle, just make your opposite edges the same size and just try to take an average measurement. So this is how I work it out. So the edge of my quilt is 54 1/4 inches. The next thing I need to do is to work that measurement out less the seam allowance. So my seam allowance is actually 3/8 of an inch. Some people like to use 1/4 of an inch, and you can do that if you like. So I need to minus off 3/8 of an inch from both edges. So 2 times 3/8 of an inch equals 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to say 54 1/4 minus 3/4 equals 53 1/2 inches. So that is the length that I'm going to make each scallop edge around the edge of the quilt. So now what I need to do is to say 53 1/2 inches multiplied by 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm just going to get the total distance around the edge of my quilt first of all, and that equals 214 inches. And now I need to divide 214 inches, which is the total length around all 4 sides of the quilt. I'm going to divide that by 40 inches, which is my fabric width. So that equals 5.35. So I'm going to round that up to 6. So what that means is I'm going to need 6 strips of fabric to be able to get my scallop all the way around the edge. So my scallop width is 4 inches. So I'm going to say 6 multiplied by my strips of 4 inches equals 24 inches. So now when I take my tape measure, here's my 24 inches. I might like to add a little bit extra and go say 28 inches. If I'm working in metric, I'll flip that over and I might purchase 70 centimeters of fabric. Now that's only going to give me enough fabric for the top, so I actually need to double that, and because I need my strips for the back also. So if I wanted to do the same fabric top and bottom, I would double that, but I'm actually going to use a different fabric for the top and a different fabric for the back of my scallop edging. Okay, so now to work out what you want your fancy edge to be. So you can just put pen to paper, have your little quilt plan, and work in with the design of your quilt. So we have blocks, they all finish about 9 inches square. You might have 12-inch blocks, you might have 20-inch blocks. So make your scallop or your points or your curves fit in with each block. So say for instance here, you might want to do a curvy edge. Now all of our edges start from the corner, less the seam allowance. You might want to make 2 curves that fit in with each block. So that would end up looking something like this. Or you might want to do scallops. So 2 scallops per block. You might want to do scallops and points. Anyway, work out what you want to do, but we're actually going to do our picket edge today. So our picket edge is a point, and we're going to do 2 points per block. So we've got 6 blocks coming down, so that means that we're going to have 12 little points going down each edge. So now to make our template, I'm just going to use some plain printer paper, and I've worked out that with my blocks, they finish approximately 9 inches square, so they're a little bit less, but I'm going to work out with 9 inches first of all. So half of 9 inches is 4.5, so that's going to give me 1 point. And also I mentioned before that my fabric strips are cut 4 inches wide. So I'm just going to get a piece of paper, I'm just going to fold it over like this, making my bottom edge nice and level. And then I'm going to, from the bottom edge, measure 4 inches. So that's my width of my fabric. My point is going to be 4.5 inches. So because I'm working on the fold, half of 4.5 inches is 2.25. So I'm going to mark 2.25 inches from the folded edge. And one other thing I just need to take into consideration now is seam allowance on the top edge. So we just want to make sure that we're going to finish our point about 1/4 inch away from the edge. So all I'm going to do now is I'm thinking, all right, I might make my point might make it start here, and then I'm going to bring it across to here. So I'm just going to measure that, or mark that in. And so that's what my template is going to be. So I'm just going to cut that out now. You can cut it out with scissors or a rotary cutter. I think I've mentioned before I have my secondary rotary cutter, so I don't blunten my rotary cutter on the paper. And so that's my little pointy template. So now what I'm going to do with my pointy template is I'm going to make it using some template plastic. So that's just a matter of sitting that on, tracing around the edge and cutting it out. Okay, because my blocks are a little bit less than 9 inches, I'm just shaving a tiny little bit off the edge of the template on both sides. So here's my little template. If you don't have template plastic, you can use cardboard. So let's start making our fancy edge. So before I start cutting out my strips, I like to give my fabric a little bit of a press. And I'm using this pinky red fabric for the back of my picket edge, and I'm using this blue for the front. Just happened to be what I had in my stash, and it ties in nicely. Okay, so I need 6 4-inch strips for the top of the picket edge and 6 4-inch strips for the back of the picket edge, and I'm cutting my strips across the fabric from selvage to selvage. So I'm all cut out. I have 6 strips for the front, 6 for the back. I now need to join them to make the edges of the quilt. And so you'll see that when I open up one strip, that is not going to be long enough. So I'm going to use another strip, and to make it really easy, because I've got 6 strips, if I take another strip, cut it in half, 1.5 strips is going to give me enough fabric to do each edge. So when you're joining the pieces to make the edge of your quilt, just make sure that they're a little bit longer, maybe 2 inches longer than the edge of the quilt. So I'm now going to go and join my strips. I'm just doing a straight join on them. There's no need to do a 45-degree angle join. Just straight join is fine. So you can either trim your selvages away first, or just take a larger seam allowance and then trim back to a 1/4 inch seam. And then just press your seams open. Now cut 4 strips of batting that are the same length as your fabric strips, but we're going to make these a little bit narrower, and they're going to be 3.5 inches wide, just to reduce the bulk in the seam allowance. Okay, so we now have our fabric for the front, we have our fabric for the back, and we have our batting that goes in between, and we now have our template. So we're going to mark our template onto the wrong side of our back fabric, and to do this, take your strip and just fold it in half so that we can work out where the halfway point is. Make a little crease, and we're going to start marking our template. So I found my center mark, and I have my template, and I'm going to mark 6 of these little picket template shapes onto either side of my center mark, because I want 12 in total. So I'm just going to rest the straight edge along one edge, and I'm just going to mark away. So I just do a little mark at the bottom edge like that to line it up, and then all I have to do, and a little mark at the top, and just marking around the edge. And then slide along, line the edge up with the mark, keeping it straight on the bottom edge, and just continue marking away. Murphy's Law, always end up with a seam in the wrong place. Well, look, it's not quite at my point, so I'm actually just going to leave that, and that will be fine. Okay, so I've marked 12 of my picket edge template, and on the outer edge ones I came back and marked in the straight edge on both sides. Now what I need to do is just go back to my quilt measurement, which was 54.25 inches. So remember, we had 54.25 minus the seam allowance, so it's actually 53.5. So I now need to measure from one end to the other end and make sure that it's 53.5 inches. And if it's not, I need to adjust to make sure that it is. So it's actually 54 inches. So that means that it's going to be 1/2 inch too big. So I'm going to divide that measurement by 2. So that's 1/4 inch. So I'm actually going to take 1/4 inch off one end and 1/4 inch off the other end. So to do this, I'm going to take my tape measure, and I'm just going to mark 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to take my template and just going to pop that back on again. And I'm just going to reshape that end. So I'll just come from here up to here. And then I'll just maneuver my template just to get that straight edge back to the point. Now you would do the same thing if you did a scallop, just curve it in. And this is quite normal, because when you're marking all of these little templates, it can easily grow. And just taking 1/4 inch off each end isn't going to be noticeable. Now go ahead and mark the remaining 3 back strips in the same way. So now I have all of my back strips marked. I'm now going to take a back strip, a front strip, and a strip of batting, and I'm going to layer those together ready for sewing. So place your batting down onto your work surface, and then place your top strip on top with the right side facing up. We're going to make one edge level, making sure it's nice and smooth, and you'll see one edge is going to have the gap of batting. That's the edge that's going to go against the quilt. And now I'm going to take my top strip, and I'm placing that on with the right side facing down. And this is where my little pointy picket edges are, and on this side here, the straight edge is the edge that has the gap of batting. If you wanted to, you could hold your top strip and the batting together with a little bit of basting spray. I'm just going to pin it, so I'm going to pop a pin in every picket edge, ready for stitching. And remember where my point almost hit my seam. On my other pieces, I started at a different point so that I didn't end up having this seam right on a point. Okay, so time for a couple of tips. If you want to draw up your own scallop edge, just make sure that your little valley here isn't going to be too deep, because that's going to be difficult to stitch, and it's also going to be even more difficult to turn through and get a nice curved edge. So whether you wanted to design something that had curves and then a point on it, as I said, make sure you don't go too deep in those valleys. Now, if you are stitching a scallop edge, and I did just mention before, sew with a small stitch length, so say a stitch length of 2, because a smaller stitch length is going to give you a much smoother curve. And when you stitch down into your valleys, just before you get to the valley, stop and do 1 stitch across before you head back up the other way. So that way, when we trim and turn that through, you're going to get a much nicer valley like I have on these quilts here, rather than one that's pulling in that little point there. Now with our picket edge, because our valley is not too deep and it's quite open, we don't need to do that 1 stitch across like we do on the scallop edge. To sew my fancy edge, I have my machine set up with a neutral coloured thread on the top and on the bottom. I have a size 80 or 85 quilting needle, that's because I'm stitching through batting. And I have just a straight stitch length with a stitch length of 2.5. If you're doing scallops, it's better to have a small stitch length because you can get a nice smooth even curve. And I also have an open toe foot on, so I can easily see my marked line when I'm sewing. So I'm just going to stitch exactly on my marked lines. So start and finish with a little reverse stitch, and basically just stitch on your marked line. So I've finished the stitching, and now I'm going to trim a 1/4 inch away, or a small 1/4 inch away from the stitching line. So something I forgot to mention, you know how we had our seams where we joined our strips to make them the correct length. On the back strip, I've got the seam up this side, and then I offset it with my seam on the front strip being at this end, so we don't have any unnecessary seams coming together creating too much bulk. And all these little pieces we've got left over, save those for a crumb quilt, and some people like to use batting for stuffing. I have seen that before. Now cut across the points and clip into the valleys. Making sure you don't go through the stitching line, but you are just a fraction away from the stitching line. So when you clip into the corners, it's good to have a nice sharp pair of scissors. So all you're doing is just using the tip and just making a little clip like that. So you can see we are a couple of threads away from the stitching line. Also being careful when you cut across those points there, all we're doing is just reducing some of the bulk, and once again, it's a couple of threads away from the stitching line, probably about 1/16 or 2 millimeters away from the stitching line. Now turn the fancy edge through to the right side.
Do you have a tip?
Yep. So when you turn the points through, pop your thumbs up into the point and then bend the seam over and then turn through like that. And then I just finish off using my little point turning tool. This will cost you a couple of dollars from your haberdashery store. And then I just poke those ends, poke those corners out like that. And just keep going until they're all turned through. And now work your way around, rolling the edges out.
What's that do?
That helps the seam to come out on the edges rather than it being, you know, staying in. We want to roll that right out.
I'm glad I asked that because that is something I would definitely not do.
Yeah. Now press from the top, and one thing you'll notice is that when you run your finger along the edge, it's nice and smooth there, and when you run your finger along the back, you'll actually be able to feel the ridge of the seam with the batting in it. So that's why this is the back and this is the front. So when you press, just try to roll the top fabric over so that you don't see the backing fabric coming to the front. Also, you can use a little bit of steam. So to top stitch, I'm using a blue thread on the top and a pink thread on the back. If your machine doesn't like using two different color threads and you have tension issues, try to just choose the one color thread. Same needle, same size 80 quilting needle, and I have just my standard foot on this time and a stitch length of 3, and I'm just going to stitch all the way around the edge, just resting the edge of my standard foot on the edge of my picket edge. That's going to give me an even distance all the way around. We're not stitching the raw edge, we're only just stitching on the neat sewn edges. You could use a 1/4 inch foot if you like. I just like my standard foot gives me a little bit more of a I don't know, space.
Yeah, you can see.
So I always like to start and finish with a little reverse stitch, and it's just a matter of following the shape and just with the edge of the foot on the edge of my shape there and pivoting when you get to the corners. So let's get sewing. So that's how you make one fancy edge, so go ahead and make the rest. Before we join our picket edge onto the quilt, trim the raw edges if necessary. Sometimes you may find that the back of the strip is extending past the front, so just trimming level to the front. To prepare to sew our picket edging on, mark a dot in each corner of the quilt that is 3/8 of an inch in from both edges. 3/8 of an inch in from this edge and 3/8 of an inch in from this edge, and that's where our dot goes there. So we're going to mark that dot in every corner. Take one scallop edge and fold it in half and mark the center with a pin. Mark the center of your quilt also on one edge, With this quilt here, we know that this seam here is the center, and I'm now going to place my scallop on, or my picket edge on, with it right sides facing my quilt, and I'm going to pin it in place from dot to dot, aligning my center. So I'm actually going to start with my center first of all. So placing the pins in crossways and easing in the quilt if necessary, and pinning at about every 3 or 7 centimeter spaces. Okay, so I like to pin my picket edge onto the opposite side of the quilt before I head to the machine to sew. Okay, so now I'm just going to sew my picket edge on with neutral coloured thread, same needle, stitch length of 3 and a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So make sure that you start and finish with a little reverse stitch. You can either sew across your pins or remove them as you go. Okay, so you know that 1/2 inch gap of batting, although when we sew the seam we're not actually stitching through it, and there may be a little gap between the stitching line and the batting itself, but that gets taken up in the fold of the seam when we're going to actually press that seam in and away from our picket edging, and it just reduces a lot of the bulk in the seam. Okay, so pin the remaining 2 picket edges on and just pin those on in the same way. Now it's really important that we pin and sew those so that they're starting from those dots. So I've got a really good tip to show you how to do that. So take this side edge and flip it out, keeping the seam allowance also facing away from the edge of the quilt, and that gives you this little bit here. So all you have to do is make sure that when you're pinning this side on, that it's going to come up and be level with the seam line of your other edging, and just pop the pin in like that. And once all the pinning's done, we can head to the machine to sew. Okay, so I'm going to start sewing my side picket edge pieces on, and I'm just going to stitch a little bit and then show you what it looks like, just so that you get an idea of what we need to do here. This is what we're aiming for. We want our picket edges to meet exactly at the corner at that dot that we made, where it's 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre in from the edge. So we now have our picket edge attached onto the quilt, and when we fold that out you can see it looks really nice on the front, but on the back we have the raw seam, which we are going to cover with the binding. So the binding is made from 2-inch strips. So to work out how much fabric you need, just head back to your little quilt plan. So with our quilt we had to have 6 4-inch strips to make our picket edge. So we're going to need 6 2-inch strips to do the binding. So you'll cut all of those strips across the fabric from selvage to selvage, join them all together end to end on a diagonal join to make one long continuous length. And then we're going to press that in half with the wrong sides facing. So it's kind of just like a normal quilt binding. What I'm going to do is I already have this pre-made 1-inch bias strip. It's on the bias, but that's okay. This actually starts off as a 2-inch strip, so I'm going to press it open and then I'm going to press it in half again to get ready to sew it onto my quilt. Just before I sew it onto my quilt, I'm going to cut one end on a 45-degree angle. That's going to help me finish with my joining, and I'm going to get started with doing that now. Sew the binding onto the top side of the quilt. I always like to start sewing on the side edge towards the bottom. When I pop my binding down, I'm going to align all of the raw edges with the raw edge of the quilt, and you'll see that the scallop is actually going to be in between the binding and the quilt. I like to start with a 6-inch tail, and I'm once again sewing with that 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance. No need to start and finish with the reverse stitch on this one, we're just going to start sewing. So this is how you sew a corner. As you approach the corner, just get your picket edges or scallop edge and just fold it out like that, so it's kind of forming a mitre, and you can see our little corner here. This is very important. So I'm just going to pop a pin in here and one on the other side just to hold them out of the way when we go to sew. Now what we want to do is we're just going to sew a little bit closer up to that corner. Okay, so when you're about 2 or 3 inches away from the corner, what we want to do is, this is very different to a traditional binding. So we're actually going to make a nick in our binding that is level with where our picket edge finishes. So you can just pop your scissors in. Now this nick is only going to be 1/4 of an inch deep, so that's about the same as 6 millimeters, so not as wide as our seam. And now I'm going to stitch down to level with that nick. So that's actually going to be on the underneath. It's actually going to be where I just do 1 stitch off the edge of that scallop edging or picket edging. And 1 more stitch. Okay, so I'm level with that neck. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift the foot and I'm going to rotate the quilt onto the next edge. So this is now my top edge, so I'm going to flip that up, and when I flip that up, what it does is it folds the corner into a mitre, so it's actually on a 45-degree angle. And now I'm just going to continue sewing, making sure I don't catch any of that scallop edging in, so being very careful there. And I'm just going to sew a little bit further just so I can show you what actually happens when you nick into the binding. So when you nick into the binding and turn the corner, you can see that the binding opens up and makes a little right angle like that. So my nick hasn't gone all the way to the stitching line. We don't want to do that, otherwise we're going to end up with some holes in our corners, but that's quite perfect like that. And I'll show you what happens with that once I've finished sewing all the binding on. So you're binding all the way around the edge of your quilt, and stop sewing about 6 inches away from where we started. That's about 15 centimetres. So basically you're going to have a 12-inch or 30-centimetre opening. I always like to have a nice big opening. Now there's lots of different ways that you can finish off your binding, and I'm going to show you a different way. So what I'm going to do is I'm opening out this part of the binding here, and I'm just going to smooth that along the edge of my quilt, and then I'm going to take this piece here and I'm going to smooth that along the edge of the quilt, and then I'm going to open it out, and you can see I have my mitre there that I already started with, so I'm actually going to mark that mitre.
Do you mean 45-degree angle?
Yep, 45-degree angle, sorry. Thank you. I always get confused. Yep, there we go. So I've marked that. Now I can't just cut that there because it's got no seam allowance on it, so I need to add some seam allowance, and the seam allowance would be a 1/4 inch for this side and a 1/4 inch for that side, so that equals 1/2 inch. So I'm just going to take my ruler and I'm going to just line it up so that I'm adding an extra 1/2 inch on like that. Just going to mark it. And then I'm going to cut that with my scissors. And once again, Murphy's Law, I do have a seam going there from my bias, but that's going to be totally fine. So what I'm going to do now, I have two 45-degree angles that are lining up. So I'm going to bring them together like this, and I'm going to pin them together. So I'm just going to have a little corner out there. So where that corner actually is, there is a 1/4 inch away from the raw edge. So I'm going to pop a pin in there, and I'm going to bring this across and pop a pin in here, and I'm going to sew that with a 1/4 inch seam. So you just have to have a little bit of a wrestle with your quilt. This is why I like to have like that bigger opening. Going to get that under my machine there, and I'm going to sew.
Do a reverse stitch?
Yeah, reverse stitch at the beginning and at the end. So there we are, I've stitched from here to here with a little reverse stitch at the beginning and at the end. And then when we open that up,
Oh, fancy.
there's our nice little join. So I just like to open that up. So I won't go to the iron and do that. I'll just finger press that open like that. That just reduces all of our bulk, and in half like that. And there we are. Now I can finish sewing this onto the edge of my quilt. So I've sewn my binding all the way around the edge of the quilt. The next step is to trim across the corners of the quilt to reduce the bulk at the corner, and then trim the seam back to a 1/4 inch. So just trim back slightly all the way around the edge of the quilt, and that's going to reduce the bulk in the seam. Now working with the wrong side of the quilt facing up, fold the binding over to cover the raw seam, and I'm going to show you how to make a mitre at the corner. So press both edges towards the mitre, and now folding this edge over, we're going to pin up to the corner, and this edge here, fold that seam in. And then you can see how that's already formed a 45-degree angle. So all we have to do now is just fold that straight over like that. Just have a little bit of a play to get a nice mitre in. Here's a tip to get a mitre: place your pin on the stitching line in the same angle as this horizontal one here, and then bring the edge over, and there's a nice little mitre there. So pop your pin in to hold it in place, just like that, and just continue pinning that binding all the way around the edge of the quilt. Okay, so you can either hand sew this binding down, or you can top stitch it down, and I'm going to top stitch it down because it ties in with my easy cover strip method, where I have these stitching lines which are sewn about 1/2 inch away from the seam on the front of the quilt. So I'm using the same colour thread in the bobbin, and I have my standard foot on, and I've actually moved my needle position all the way over to the left as far as it will go. So all I have to do is rest the edge of my foot on the seam, and then I'm just going to sew. I have a stitch length of 3 because I'm stitching through lots of layers, and starting with a little reverse stitch, And I'm more sort of concentrating on the fact that I want my stitching line to look really nice and straight on the front. So I'm really concentrating on the edge of the foot in the seam, and I'm just going to sew all the way around. When I get to the corner, I'll show you how to sew the corner. To sew the corner, just hold that corner in place, the mitre in place with a pin, stitch up to it, stop with the needle in the down position, pivot onto the next edge of the quilt, and continue sewing. So this is what it looks like from the back, and this is what it looks like from the front. I have a top stitching line that's sewn about 1/2 inch away from the edge, and this ties in with my stitching lines that attach the cover strips, so they're sewn 1/2 inch away from the seam. Okay, so I've got a little bit more sewing to do, so stick around for the big reveal. All finished. I'm really happy with how that turned out. I did actually come back and do an extra row of stitching on the picket edge, and all I did was just move my needle position all the way over to the far right, and that gave me a distance of about 1/2 inch away from the seam. I did that because the batting isn't actually caught in the actual seam, and I just wanted to secure the batting. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our blog post.